Welcome to Make Your Money Matter with Brad Barrett, the show that aims to change the way you think about wealth management. Brad is a certified financial advisor, established radio host, and author of Retire Right. He is a managing director and partner at One Capital Management, an SEC-registered investment advisory firm managing over $4 billion for clients across the nation. Brad and his team are dedicated to helping clients protect and preserve their assets so they can reach their investment and retirement goals. And now, your host of Make Your Money Matter, Brad Barrett.
Hey everyone, welcome to Make Your Money Matter. I'm your host, Brad Barrett. I'm also a managing director and partner here at One Capital Management, and I'm here each week and every week to encourage you and build confidence when it comes to your finances, because after all, your money matters. We have a good show today, but I want to start off with something, and this is going to sound like a tangent, but I promise I'll put a bow to it here. You know, I've talked to many parents and friends and colleagues who have kids about eating and their eating habits and how we all have different palates. I have two kids. I have a boy and a girl, and my son, I don't know if any of you listening or watching right now, will literally only eat crunchy foods that are the color beige. I'm convinced. And I don't know if anyone out there relates to this or not, but I mean, Ritz is like the main part of his diet. He won't eat anything green or red. We can sometimes get some fruit into him, maybe a little bit of meat, but that's it. My daughter, Kate, on the other hand, will literally eat anything off the plate. And my wife, Veronica, and I were talking about this heading into my son's first grade, as we were thinking, man, we really gotta progress his eating because he's growing. He's gotta eat more vegetables and, you know, the typical parent things. And as we started talking about it, we started going through what we feed him each day. We started realizing there's actually some good in there. There's some bad, but there is some good. And then there's just the ugly, the sugar. There's the not so terrible, the not so ugly, the bad, like the Ritz crackers. It's not great for you, but it's not gonna kill you. And there's the good. I mean, he does have some good in there. There's some apples that he eats. He likes pears and certain things like that. And I'm sharing this for this reason. I promised I'd put a bow on this to lead into this week's episode around tax hikes and what we've come to know in the past few weeks as the Inflation Reduction Act. I'm calling it the good, the bad, and the ugly. All right, let's get into it. With the Senate a week or two ago having passed a budget plan with only Democratic votes, by the way, broken by the Vice President Harris, you know, as we saw, President Biden signed the first significant tax hike since the fiscal cliff tax hike, believe it or not, in 2013. Now, what's important to keep in mind as I go through today's episode, and as many of you have been reading and listening and watching on what they're calling the Inflation Reduction Act, well, actually, there is, in our opinion, zero inflation in mind with this, that's being reduced. But again, we want to talk about this because what's important to keep in mind is that it could have been worse, much, much worse than what our administration originally set out to do. We have to remember this. This is the good. To raise the top tax rate was one of the agenda items, back to the 39.6 where it was before the 2017 Jobs and Tax Cut Acts, otherwise known as the Trump tax cuts. They didn't get that. The administration also wanted to raise the top tax rate on long-term capital gains and dividends up to 39.6 versus the current 20%. That also didn't happen. He also wanted to get rid of the step-up basis at death. Didn't happen either. He wanted to raise regular corporate tax rate to 28% from the current 21%. Basically, it's going back to the 28% versus what Trump brought it down to in 21%. And then the tax carried interest as well. Again, no dice, didn't get it. So compared to what the administration sought out to do, the tax hike, the quote unquote Inflation Reduction Act, we're soon going to be seeing here is a shadow of its former self. Welcome to DC politics, my friend. As I've shared many times before, we do not have the luxury of being on either side of the aisle. Our job is to go right down the middle and give you the facts and understand how that relates to your planning, your investments, and the economy. Now, here's what I want to break down. This is where we go from the good to the bad. The three most prominent sources of more government revenue will now be this: a new 15% minimum tax on the book profits of large publicly traded companies, basically a beefed up IRS enforcement against the middle class, which we saw, and a new 1% tax on stock buybacks. Now, all these changes are not all by themselves going to throw the economy into a recession. Monetary policy, quite frankly, eventually getting tight will generate a recession all by itself. I digress. That doesn't mean what I just mentioned, that these tax changes are good ideas. Take, for example, the new 15% minimum tax on companies. Essentially, Congress is, I'll call it outsourcing tax policy to FASB, the Financial Accounting Standards Board, which is a private organization that develops accounting standards. Now, meanwhile, companies that might be affected by this tax will find ways to avoid it. One example I can think of in just reorganizing is tax deductions are taken by more profitable spinoffs that are going to pay taxes above the minimum. So the 1%, switching over to that for a second, on stock buybacks is another new and bizarre policy change. The theory is this, that companies should be using that money for business investment, not buybacks. But if a company is generating more cash flow, then it can effectively invest, and a buyback is better than just having the money sit in the corporate treasury. I mean, for example, bad managers, they are out there, might use it for empire building, unprofitable investments, or even to boost their own pay or something like that. I mean, by the way, both sides of the aisle don't like that. Every political pundit has always said that CEOs have too much pay. So this gives the incentive to do that. Now, Democrats and Republicans have the same issues with these huge CEOs, as I've shared. They're inflated pay. Moreover, many of the politic and political advocates for a buyback tax claim that they want fewer large companies dominating markets. Essentially, they want fewer monopolies, and that just makes sense. But slowing buybacks means big incumbent companies have more of a reason to simply keep cash on their own books. So instead of distributing it to shareholders, who can then, if they want to, invest more in newer upstart companies, it literally moves us, in my opinion, backwards from the idea of true independence for letting the investors of the world, you and me together, choose our destiny, choose where we want to invest in. It allows these big companies that are investing in to say, hey, we're going to pay this 1% tax on buybacks, so what would we do? So it's funny when you look at these things, the incentives or the disincentives, I should say, are out there again, good, bad, and the ugly. Again, the good is that it could have been much worse, much, much worse. And I know that's a statement like, okay, I get it, Brad, but it's still not great. Yes, but there are also some aspects to this that allows companies to move around. And the good news is that just like the 15% minimum tax, companies can and most likely will adjust their behavior to avoid the new tax on these buybacks. Again, they can even raise dividends as an example. And this is also why Congress, by the way, is probably, in our opinion, overestimating the revenue. And it's ironic right now because we're also sitting here at a time when after the Inflation Reduction Act gets passed, we also have our administration announcing student loans. And for all clients listening right now and for all investors out there, there's a lot more information that's going to come, but I want to share some stats with you. And I'm going to read a little bit because it's quite heavy. And this piggybacks off of what we just spoke about in terms of the administration and Congress's estimates for income. The administration says that changes to the student loans would cost $240 billion in the next 10 years. Now, interestingly enough, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget says it's $440 to $600 billion, and a budget model from Wharton says $1 trillion. But even that $1 trillion, in a lot of people's opinion, might actually be way too low. So what's interesting about this, and this is where we get into the ugly, when you combine a lot of these reduction acts happening right now, it impacts our investments. I mentioned some of the ideas that we didn't get the income, the administration didn't get the income taxes back to where they wanted to from a higher level, but they did pass some very interesting and unique 15% on book profits for companies, 1% on stock buybacks. So they're trying their ways to get in there, but it's interesting when you look at economics and why I'm such a fan of it is how you can uniquely move around that and what that actually means for companies and ultimately what that means for us as advisors, what that means for you as investors. And so we're going to tie a bow on this when it comes to the ugly is basically this. When you combine a lot of these at the same time, trying to, in my opinion, market for whether it's votes or something else. And by the way, this is true of any administration. This is not just this administration. You have to be really careful about how we as the public see this. And so I want to share this openly with those of you who are looking at your investments, looking at your retirement plans. Maybe you're sitting on the eve of retirement, about to retire. Maybe you're in retirement, and we've been talking about this heavily on the show and with our clients who are in retirement, maybe on a fixed income. For example, you're like, inflation is eating away at my once really great pension or my once really great Social Security that was able to, sustain my life. These are all really important factors. And this is where you have to make sure we align the investments that you have, the liquidity that you have with all these policies coming out of DC. And right or wrong, they're coming out with these because they are trying to tackle these inflation numbers, these supply chain issues. And we're going to talk more about this because the details are going to be somewhat muddy. So we have to go through this. We're going to have some time to sift through it and make sure we know how to effectively advise on it. But I would be remiss if I didn't bring this up today.
Stay connected. Get frequent updates on the show. Follow Brad Barrett and Make Your Money Matter on most social media platforms. And catch full episodes of Make Your Money Matter streaming now on our YouTube channel. To schedule your no-obligation appointment, go to onecapital.com or call 805-410-5454.
We're also, I should say, highly skeptical that the federal government will hit its revenue projections for the next fiscal year and really beyond. Again, I'm not trying to downplay this. I want them to succeed. I want us as a country to succeed. I want all of us as Americans, but it's hard for me to get around some of the estimates around the budget that the government expects to hit. That basically means they're going to tax us more, right? I mean, which is not a great thing across the board. This year, there's been a surge in tax revenue, which is a side effect of all the stimulus money in 2020 and 2021, which is creating I'll call it a feedback loop of borrowing, printing, and spending that also creates an illusionary tax receipts for the government. And now, ironically, again, I'm not sure why they're not seeing this, but I digress. As a result, the budget deficit is in the past 12 months is actually slightly smaller than it was in the 12 months prior to the shutdown. So as the economy slows and as the artificial stimulus wears off, revenue growth will likely slow. That's a reasonable assumption. And a recession, and when a recession eventually hits, it could easily turn negative. So the bottom line here is that this budget deal will raise spending on tax rates over the next decades. And this, my friends, is not the best for the economy's long-term growth potential. But here's the point I want to bring back here. We've had much larger tax hikes in the past and survived. I want to say that again. We've had much larger tax hikes in the past and survived, and not just survived, but thrived. So when we say something to the extent of, a budget deal like this is going to raise spending and taxes and it's not going to be great for long-term growth, the good part of it is there's two parts. One, it could have been much worse, which I think is important to put in context. And we've had much worse and survived in the past. So everyone out there who's kind of doom and gloom right now, looking at, tomorrow and the next year and 10 years from now, it's not as bad as we think. And number two, and I know how optimistic this sounds, by the way, there's always going to be headwinds. But the number 2 point here is the matter is when we've gone through these kind of things and we've survived them, we also have the ability to adapt, just like the corporate companies will adapt to these new changes in tax code. And one thing that I think is the common, like almost always underdog, is the ability for the average American, you and me, and our companies and our potential here as innovators and entrepreneurs to navigate the landscape here in the US. Every time DC comes out with something, it allows CEOs, good CEOs and good business owners to navigate. That's the beauty of our system. And I've shared this before. And it's really interesting to note, there are like over 200 plus democracies in the world. I think we forget that sometimes. And it's not our freedom and our democracy that makes us great. It's a part of it. It's two main factors that we sometimes forget. And I do believe in that there's these two factors I think are really important. We know we have freedom of speech, but the two main factors are rule of law and property rights. We have to remember these kind of things. Now, the first one has been under attack for the past 2 years, and I'm sure I may be a little bit polarizing in saying this, but that is something we just cannot have. That is wrong. And we need to always make sure that we are growing, yes, but we need to never be able to attack the rule of law. We want to grow, yes, but that rule of law holds us together with property rights. And when you buy something here in the United States, when you own something here, it cannot be taken from you. It's very hard to be taken from you with that. Now, remember that anything that comes out from policy or regulation is just a new playground. It's a new playground for CEOs and business owners and entrepreneurs to navigate these waters, find the loopholes, the legal ones, obviously, and navigate through them. Now, I mentioned a few from what it could have been worse on these tax hikes with the quote unquote Inflation Reduction Act, which are really just tax hikes, let's be honest. And we haven't seen this again since 2013, where the fiscal cliff tax hike was around the presidency and the administration. Remember, our administration currently on the platform wanted to go to 39.6 tax rate. Didn't get it. He wanted to bring long-term capital gains up to 39.6 from 20%. Didn't get it. He also wanted to raise corporate tax rates from 21% to 28% and tax carried interest on investments. Didn't get it. So again, that's the good. The bad is we still have tax hikes. We have a 15% minimum tax on government revenue. We have a beefed up IRS enforcement, like 87,000, I think was the number. I mean, it's crazy. But as always, the American spirit will live on. And what you don't do matters as much as what you do do. And what I mean by that is, if you are staying steadfast to your discipline, to your approach, to your diversification, that wins out more than overreacting. Again, it's not always what you do, but what you don't do. And we see a lot of the data and a lot of the sentiment out there, as more negative. And I understand that a lot of volatility has happened this year. We've been talking about it on this show. We've had interest rates, quadruple basically. We've had wars overseas. We've had a president and administration kind of flip-flop on things that he ran on. And now we have an inflation running rampant, which is, again, as I shared before a couple weeks ago, it's not surprising. When you shut down the world and print money, this is the exact recipe. This is how it happens. We're going to have headwinds. If you lined up a bunch of nerds like me, economics, and you put us in a room to incubate inflation, we'd add two things, right? We would say, shut everything down from a production standpoint, and let's just inject some money. That's what we're seeing. So we need to make sure we keep the long-term vision in focus. And for anyone listening here, let's say you're 85 years old, for example, and the long-term becomes a little bit less long-term, just to speak that way plainly, understand this. If you're working with an advisor, we're obviously adapting and changing to each client's portfolio and their planning. And if you're not working with us and you want to talk to an advisor, you make sure you allocate your time horizon and relative to your investments. I shared this last week, but God willing, the same amount of time you had while you were working during your accumulation period, you will have in retirement. Remember that. It's a long-term focus. I talk to a lot of people, a lot of clients from our radio show, from our YouTube show, from our podcast, and from our clients. When they're retiring, let's just use the normal retirement age of 65 or 66. They have this vision that they've worked for 30 or 40 years, and the retirement's a finish line. I want to share very openly that it's not. Barring a national holiday, you retire on a Friday, markets are open Monday. Again, God willing, the same amount of time you had while working, you'll hopefully have in retirement. Getting back to the advisor conversation, as I share each week and every week, this is not meant to be all roads leads to Brad Barrett or One Capital Management or our fiduciary advisors here. I want for our investors and for our listeners and our viewers here and our subscribers, longevity. We want sustainability, and having counsel, an advisor to navigate those areas for you matters. Everything from investment philosophy and staying the course, not getting disrupted because of emotional investing and volatility. Again, not always what you do, but what you don't do. All the way down to managing the potholes that are out there around the corner that you haven't seen, but we've gone through. Everything from tax planning to investment planning to estate planning, insurances. That all comes up. So with all that I mentioned here on the Inflation Reduction Act, touched on the student loan fiasco, I'll call it right now, which we still have some more data coming out there. I wanted to at least spend this week's show to kind of talk through an advisor's approach on the economic data, how the taxes implicate certain things. This is where you want to sit with counsel and your advisor to walk through these rise in tax rates and how your portfolio will be positioned and weathered to make sure we manage that. Again, not on all roads leads to One Capital on our show here, but if you want to reach out to us, please do so. We'd love to hear from you. And now's the time in the show where I want to answer some questions. If you have a question or a topic you would like me to address, you can always leave a comment or a question in the comment section. Or again, if it's something a bit more personal, you just want to go about it one-on-one, you can go to the About page on this channel and send us an email. We'll always keep the questions I read here anonymous, so never have to worry about your name being shared, but we would love to hear from you. So this week's question was actually kind of interesting, and I just liked it, how just simple it was, right? Are tax brackets still a thing? And the sub-question was, if so, how do I know what bracket I'm in? Yes, we are in a marginal tax bracket system. One of the best ways and easiest ways is you can Google 2022 tax brackets. It'll show you individual versus married, filing jointly, or head of household, and it'll share with you that kind of environment. But I want to add something to this. For those that don't know what tax bracket they're in, or even why a financial advisor or an investment manager is even talking about taxes, because taxes have everything to do with your investments. Taxes have everything to do with your retirement or living financially free, because it's a part of your financial life. Ben Franklin said it best, right? Death and taxes are two certain things in life. So one of the things I mentioned when you do look up your bracket and go through the marginal tax bracket code is make sure you sit with an advisor who integrates. And integration is really important when you focus on retirement planning, income planning, investment planning, and then your tax rates. Because if you don't do that, you're not really having the left hand talk to the right hand. And this is where it comes in, because I actually call it the bracket game. We want to maximize the highest of the lowest tax bracket. This is rough numbers, but right now, married, filing jointly, if you're making $80,000 a year, you're right around the 12% tax bracket. Once you bump above that, you go from 12% to 22%. Again, rough numbers, and this is on married filing jointly. So let's say you're making $65,000 a year. You have $15,000 to go before you get to that next tax bracket. So if you talk about things like Roth conversions or planning, you can utilize that because you can maximize the highest of the lowest tax bracket and making sure you don't jump into that next one if you can control it. That's the beauty of our system. It's the beauty of the playground you can play in, right? With the beauty of marginal tax bracket codes. And so, yes, we still have marginal tax brackets. The best way to look it up is obviously just Google it, sit with your tax advisor, understand your effective rate, which combines your federal and your state, if you live in a state that has state income tax. And again, if you have a question or comment you'd like me to read here, you can leave it in the comment section or email us in the About page on our channel. Now, before we go, if you found anything helpful today and want to learn more, you can visit us at onecapital.com. You can also call or text us. We want to help. Listen, there's no pressure here. We don't treat people like a number. In fact, we value our relationships. It's the lifeblood of what we do. So click, call, or text us today. And if you're not following us on social media, you should be. You can follow us at Make Your Money Matter. We're sharing great information on all of our social media platforms. And as I often say, if you enjoyed the show, share it with someone you like. I guess if you don't like the show, share it with someone you don't like. But until next time, make your money matter.
The information in this show is educational and general in nature and does not take into consideration a listener's personal circumstances. Therefore, it is not intended to be a substitute for specific individualized financial, legal, or tax advice. To determine which strategies or investments may be suitable for you, consult the appropriate qualified professional prior to making a final decision.